Greetings, friends. A few words of reflection on the readings for this third Sunday of Lent. I'm going to give this homily, make this reflection on the readings for Year B. If you go to Mass, and if they're doing the scrutiny for the catechumens, those would be from Cycle A. So just be aware there's two sets of readings for this third Sunday of Lent, depending on whether or not the scrutiny is being celebrated at that liturgy. I'd just like to begin with the words from the Psalm. This is Psalm 19, and the refrain is actually from John 6, Lord, you have the words of everlasting life. But then that refrain, that response is given with the verses from Psalm 19. The law of the Lord is perfect, refreshing the soul. The precepts of the Lord are right, rejoicing the heart. I think these are pretty counterintuitive images. You know, if we think of God's law, if we think of the Lord's precepts, certainly in our culture, I don't know that the thing we think of is refreshment or rejoicing, right? We tend to, I think, maybe feel the weight of the law or the law kind of burdening us or constricting our freedom. And so I think the psalm gives us occasion to reflect on this mystery of true freedom, and especially when we draw that into conversation with the other readings. So the first reading is Exodus 20. It's the Ten Commandments, right? These familiar, for the most part, prohibitions, right? You shall not kill, you shall not commit adultery, you shall not steal. These admonitions to honor your father and mother, to keep holy the Sabbath, not to take the name of the Lord your God in vain. So these Ten Commandments are fundamentally and mostly the natural law, right? They point us away from sin, away from crime, and towards virtue, towards the things that are good. But the Ten Commandments are a path to freedom. These are things that reduce our freedom, right? If we engage in breaking the Ten Commandments, we end up slaves of sin, not truly free. So it's true that God's law actually is part of the context, one of the things that fosters freedom for us. And I think to say that is one thing, but really to live that, right, to kind of live rooted in that truth is another thing. Because so often, again, God's law is presented to us as kind of a set of rules that constrain us, that take us away from freedom. So during this Lenten season, maybe we need some of what happens in our gospel passage from the Gospel of John, the second chapter. This is the cleansing of the temple. Jesus drives out the money changers. He drives out those who are turning the God's house into a marketplace. So Jesus drives out of the temple that which is kind of perverting its purpose, that which is distorting its beauty, this beautiful worship to God that's supposed to be offered there. And I think this Lenten season, the Lord Jesus might want to do the same thing. He might want to drive out of our hearts falsehood, so true worship, so pure hearts, so a deeper freedom can result in our lives. So that path to freedom isn't just God's law or reducible to God's law, but it's really a path that's found fundamentally in following Jesus Christ, right? So God's law was a beginning, a preparation, but in the fullness of time, God did something more than reveal his law to his people, but he came himself and he walked the path, paradoxically, to the cross that led to freedom. And so that is captured in just a very few words in our second reading. Jews demand signs and Greeks look for wisdom, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to Gentiles, but to those who are called Jews and Greeks alike, Christ the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human wisdom, and the weakness of God is stronger than human strength. The fundamental paradox is that on the cross, Jesus won freedom for us, that the freest person in history, perhaps we could say, is Jesus, who is held to the cross by love, who by embracing that total gift of himself won for all eternity. He won freedom for the whole human race, a freedom that's offered to us. So, brothers and sisters, to fully apply these principles to all the kind of the controversies of our modern era is far beyond the scope of this homily and probably beyond my capacity as a homilist or even to really think that all through. But just notice, right, lots of invitations in our culture, not to follow God's law and to lay down our lives, but to take, to assert, right, to kind of follow every impulse of our heart, right, to take our desires and emotions as the absolute rule of our lives, right? Ironically, our culture often encourages us to be ruled by our passions, all right, to be enslaved by our passions, and suggest that would be freedom. Of course, it's not anything of the sort. Our desires, the movement of our hearts, are not to be disparaged or ignored, right? But they do need to be purified and directed and shaped by what's true. The fact that we desire something or desire to do something by itself really tells us nothing about whether it's good or bad. We frequently desire to do things that are false or evil. And so God's law, again, is, just to kind of come back to where we started, God's law refreshes us. It brings us joy because it directs the desires of our hearts in channels and paths that are true, that are life-giving. And finally, following those paths, we end up following Christ and following him even to the cross with its loss, with its self-emptying, but the cross that leads to the resurrection. Let's ask the Lord in your life and in mine, in each of our lives, maybe to show us these places where we need to be freed from enslavement to our passions, places where we need to be drawn deeper into freedom, a freedom in Jesus Christ, a freedom that is fostered and facilitated by God's loving commandments to us. Brothers and sisters, know my prayers for you. Please pray for me. God bless.